Okay, I think we will get started. I would just like to begin with a general announcement that we will be recording this and making it available both internally and externally. And also that we would appreciate after the talk, if you would use the Q&A function on the bottom bar rather than the chat function so that other attendees can rank questions and we can make sure that they're answered in the most expeditious way. So thank you for your cooperation with that. I would like to get started now. It's really a great honor to introduce Dr. Tim Stone, CBE. Tim has been an honorary professor at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction and our predecessor, the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management, for over a decade. Tim is, as many of you know, the chairman of the Nuclear Industry Association and of Nuclear Risk Insurers Limited, and a non-executive director at Arup. He spent 15 years as an expert of the board to the European Investment Bank, and has worked extensively with the Cabinet Office and advised other Whitehall departments, most notably the Department of Energy and Climate Change, on all aspects of energy policy, especially the transformation of the energy mix and of the low carbon transition. We are thrilled to welcome him today to present a keynote address on resilience, a state obligation. Thank you, and over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, D'Maris. And let's just make sure we get all this lot to behave itself right. First of all, recognising this is an open lecture, I may be a little cautious in some of my words in places, but what I want to do is to catalyse some conversations and wind you up a little bit if I can. And the word resilience will reduce in number as I go through the talk, as I talk more about some of the issues behind it. But just to start with, this is what we said I'd basically try and talk about today in the flyer. And I'm basically going to be looking at the fact that for resilience, particularly in infrastructure, but lots of other areas as well, there are some things that governments simply cannot get away from. They have to make things happen. And I'll talk more about issues where they fail, not just in the UK, but more broadly. So let's start by looking at what we mean by resilience, because it's not entirely straightforward. A couple of dictionary definitions for you. The capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness. But also the ability of a substance or an object to spring back into shape. It's basically about surviving change, surviving surprises, not necessarily shattering shocks. It's not about earthquakes necessarily, although perhaps. But it's not the same as sustainability. And we're going to come on to that in a minute. But there are many aspects to resilience. There's lots of different bits here. The bits in grey I'm not really going to talk about. All the rest will be referred to in one way or another in what I'm talking about to follow. But in every single aspect on this page, it always still comes back to government, even down to societal resilience, the way that society can bounce back and cope with change. Part of that is an expectation that change is inevitable for society, and the lead for that comes from leadership in government. You can't escape it. But we'll not dwell on some of these points today, but where all the things I'm going to say, you can come back to this page and add the ideas to the analysis of these points. So it's broad. It's not just about climate change and adaptation to it, but it's about the wider way in which we live, in which we survive, in which we adapt, and how we create the institutions to keep us safe. And as I said earlier, it's not just about the physical aspects, but it's larger than that. Ultimately, you cannot escape it. It is a basic function of any competent government, and I hope I'll make my case for that as we go through. Resilience and sustainability are not quite the same thing, but they're kind of close. The definition at the bottom is quite useful. But I thought you might like to see this graph, which I found, and it's the appearance of the frequency of the use of the word sustainable in US English text as a percentage of the words by year. And it's a pretty scary graph, and one that's really surprised me. On a log basis, it's kind of linear. And if you look at that curve, it does end up with some pretty scary results. And that should be 2219, by the way, not 2119. Google isn't always perfect. But it's a fascinating thing that the ideas of resilience and sustainability have been gathering pace and gathering relevance for some time. And with climate change, it's fundamental to everything that we're thinking about. So I want to briefly run through some of the consequences of failure of resilience and this is really just to remind you of one or two bits and pieces, most of which you'll be familiar with, but it's just to set the context really. So let me just pick my pet one. And as D'Maris said, these days I do a lot of my work is in energy, but I spent much of my career doing bigger infrastructure. So things like High Speed 1, I'm one of the guys behind that. Lots of road and rail projects. I did a review of the rail industry for the government in 2004. But look at this on gas spot prices. I mean, frankly, if you look at those sort of numbers versus what we've looked at, I mean, GFC didn't do much to it. Look at that. And frankly, that is the best example I can think of an utter failure of resilience in a system. And that's another word that's going to keep popping up. You get a similar thing with electricity prices. You know, going back to the beginning of last year, all of a sudden, bang, spot prices. I used Hinkley there as a reference point to give you some idea. That's about where market traditionally normally is, somewhere around there. That's where Hinkley is, which is often lambasted, even though some of the renewables are much higher than that. But look at this, these are huge numbers. And it's about the lack of resilience of the energy system. It's true in water too. We've had problems with water in the north and the south. There are heat waves across Europe that damage water supply. One little known fact, parts of East Anglia, where I'm actually on the very west of East Anglia sitting here, but parts of East Anglia have lower rainfall than Beirut. We don't think of East Anglia as being pretty close to desert conditions, but parts of it are. And we don't have resilient water supplies, let alone sewage. And you know, when we see government saying that the amount of sewage is just simply unacceptable, the discharge into rivers is unacceptable, it's a pretty profound state of affairs. And look at the numbers for the cost of fixing complete elimination of sewage discharges through storm overflows, between 350 and 600 billion. I mean, even just managing it is between 160 and 280. These are really big numbers, and it flows back, pardon the pun, to the lack of resilience built into the design of the sewage systems from the outset. Rivers, and interestingly, from the Environmental Audit Committee in the UK Parliament, even they're talking about the consequences of budget cuts to the Environment Agency and the fact that only 14% of rivers, English rivers, meet good ecological standards. I mean, it's an astonishing state of affairs. And as for beaches, look at the numbers. But again, we're talking big billions to fix things, to just adapt current policies to protect the coastline from climate change. We are sitting with profound failures all around us. When we get to transport, this one's the Stonehaven crash recently, where the infrastructure basically failed. In fact, if you look in the middle of the picture, just around there, you can see where the track failed. This is just a fundamental issue of lack of preparedness, of lack of planning, lack of continuous maintenance, and so on. As for roads, we haven't planned for roads properly, and we certainly haven't planned for this. Air traffic control. Can you imagine being an air traffic controller trying to deal with that lot? You're at the stage now where the density of flights in some parts of the air traffic control system are such that the poor guy dealing with the screen has got to deal with a number of aircraft in here, but aircraft coming over the boundaries. And you know, the boundary, the interface problem becomes even worse as you try and make the sector smaller. It's a very difficult problem, and we have really not been investing properly in air traffic control either. As for bridges, this photograph is taken from last week when President Biden was going to give a speech about his $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and 4 hours before he got there, a whacking great bridge collapsed, and you can see some of the sense of that. The weather makes it look pretty artistic, but it was not artistic for those people involved. So resilience, failure of resilience is all around us. So let's come back and look at the commissioning of infrastructure in the first place, and I've got a little bit of history to come in a minute. It's been a mixed economy for some time. You can see the bits that are nominally privatised, you know, water and energy, air traffic control. There is fundamentally public provision in some transport, despite rail franchising, and I hate to admit being involved in PFI these days, because it's nearly as bad as admitting having been a banker during the GFC. But it's still mixed, but the fundamental issue is that the state ultimately controls the commissioning of infrastructure. No matter what mechanisms we're using, it's down to the state to ensure that infrastructure is commissioned. I want to take you back to 1997, and in the days before privatisation, I put the source down there, but the Conservative Research Department had a group which was called the Nationalised Industries Policy Group, and they did a report which was led by a subsequent MP called Nick Ridley. And this is one page from it, and it's looking as part of privatisation, potential privatisation. The next stage should be to break up the industries into smaller units. I don't normally read all my slides, but I'm going to read this one because it's quite profound. The reasons for doing this are to break up the power of monopoly public sector unions, to root out inefficient units and cross-subsidisation, to spread responsibility and power wider within management, to make it easier for the worker to link his reward with his own effort, and to facilitate denationalisation. Now look at what follows. The scope for fragmenting the industries varies from industry to industry. It is greatest in coal, shipbuilding, docks, airports, car manufacture, buses and freight. Just imagine all that lot still being in the public sector. It's in between for airways, steel, aircraft, nuclear fuel, cable and wireless, and it's minimal, the true utilities, in gas, electricity, railways, water, posts, telephones and underground railways. And guess what we did? We have split up the gas industry, the electricity industry, the railway industry through franchising, not the infrastructure just yet. We split up the water, we split up telephones in the mobile phone systems. We haven't really split up posts, but we allowed competition. But fundamentally, despite the original analysis saying that the opportunities and the scope for fragmenting industries is very low in that Group C list, guess what we did? So we even went against our own advice in the first place. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But it leads to some significant truths in all this. And for nationally significant infrastructure, whatever you do, governments own failure. They cannot escape it. Because no matter what happens, when stuff really goes wrong, guess who picks up the tab? Guess who was utterly walloped by the increase in gas prices in September? That on that slide I showed you earlier on, it comes back to government, because it doesn't matter what you put in place through contract. The doctrine of force majeure means that ultimate failure cannot be outsourced. Eventually, they give you the keys back. As D'Maris said, I spent some time in government. I was the advisor to the Secretary of State responsible for energy, and I was originally brought in to sort out the financing for future nuclear waste. And I had a big argument with some officials, and I said that when it comes to paying for the nuclear waste, you've got to set a price for it, well, at least a cap anyway, because if you don't, and you simply say, we'll send you a bill in 60 years' time when it comes time to pay for the waste, if it turns out that the company hasn't made sufficient provision and they don't have the money, they'll simply hand the keys back and say, I'm really sorry, I'm bust, I can't do it. You cannot force unlimited liability into the private sector, even as a matter of law, because funnily enough, the L in PLC stands for limited. It's a public limited company. So fundamentally, whatever happens, failure comes back to government. So it therefore means that if government doesn't actually take this right to the heart of what it's doing, ultimately it's just a short odd bets on the health and prosperity of citizens, which is frankly pretty flaky. So I want to talk now for a few minutes about economic regulation. And let me just check on the participants to see if I've got anybody there from this world who I don't immediately see. Anyway, let's have a look at it. I wonder if it's outlived its usefulness in its current form, because as we now know it, the current economic regulation was really created to solve the 1980s problem around BT privatisation. And the chap who dreamt it all up, an extremely clever chap by the name of Stephen Littlechild, in a paper he wrote, and the quote's there, he said it's essentially a means of preventing the worst excesses of monopoly. It's not a substitute for competition, it's a means of holding the fort until competition arrives. And in some respects, real competition hasn't arisen. And so I think that there's a real issue about the duties that flow from all this that are just no longer relevant for the time of climate change. And if you think back, we've not really looked at regulation in big picture principle since it was first set up. There's been all manner of delicate creation and sharpening of the original concepts, and lots of work on how do you set the cost of capital in different sectors. But in terms of going right back to scratch, we haven't done it. And I think now we need to think quite hard about regulation should work given what's going on with climate change, because the pace and scale of what we have to do if we're going to get anywhere near net zero is simply profound. It's massive. And what's been happening, as I said, is that we've been crudely, and I know this is meant to wind you up, but it's been band-aid solutions on duties. It's not been a proper go back to scratch. Are we doing it right? There is at least now the Regulatory Horizons Council who start to look at these sorts of issues, but they've not been let loose on big economic regulation at all. And one of the challenges, of course, is if you were to do that from a financial market point of view, how do you then trust regulators when their duties are changed? You've got to manage the signalling of this very carefully, because fundamentally without the confidence and trust that regulators have undoubtedly created in financial markets, investment probably isn't going to happen. But so later on, maybe we want to talk about how we might embed a duty of resilience in a regulatory system. I now want to turn to two phrases that I hate with a vengeance: value for money and value engineering. And having been involved in lots of advisory jobs with government, where I've used the term value for money, the more I've looked at it, the more it worries me immensely. And you'll see why from the subtitle here. So let's just look at a little example. In the late 1850s, early 1860s, Parliament basically couldn't sit because of the stink that came from the River Thames. Because what happened in those days was the sewers flowed into the Thames, and the theory was the sewage would go down the river and out to sea, except it didn't, because the tide would come back in and push it all back up again. And it got to the stage where Parliament couldn't sit. They had calcium chloride blankets hanging on windows to try and absorb the smell, but it was just appalling. And they commissioned a chap to work out what to do. And what Bazalgette did, and this is quite a summary, and it's even more sophisticated if you read the full details, but he designed the sewers not only for a population in 100 years' time, having worked out just how big London might be by then, but he also assumed some major increases in flow, because in the 1840s the flushing toilet had been invented. He assumed that was going to happen over again, and he then doubled his own basic design. If you look at the infrastructure decisions we take today, just like the ones he took, they create consequences and obligations for generations to come. Those phrases, creating obligations and consequences for generations to come, are one of the phrases I'd like all of you to walk away from this talk remembering and repeating. The issue is that they need to be good consequences, and we need to be recognising over again that all our infrastructure, really quite broadly, tends to be pretty long-lived, and we have to think about the whole life right the way through, not just to the end of the life, but the consequences. So in my world, decommissioning of offshore wind turbines, of oil and gas rigs, of nuclear power stations. And one of the things that struck me over the years is that value for money really doesn't reflect the proper focus on that long-term resilience and whole lifetime costs. It really doesn't. And fundamentally it comes back to that horrible trilemma. I don't even like that word particularly, but the eternal tension between time and scope and cost of projects. And if you look at any big project, one of those three is always hacked, if not two of the three, from the original intent and the original outcomes that people were searching for when they set the project up. The other side of this, as I said, from not just value for money, value engineering, I will translate into how little can you get away with, basically. How little can you put into it? And it inevitably diminishes resilience. If Bazalgette had taken that view when he was building the sewers and he'd value engineered the sewers, they wouldn't still be around today. They wouldn't be working. There'd be a massive bill to keep them going. So as I said, VFM definitions don't even really pick up these true obligations, and I've given you a little example there. They tend to be upfront cash-based, and it's a consequence, really, I think, of narrow market-based thinking, and we'll talk about markets in a minute. And whilst value engineering is intended to avoid gold plating, the fundamental issue is it's it is generally disconnected from the outcome that the project or the gadget was seeking to deliver. And one of the, the fundamental issues for anything which is long-lived is you always have to have in mind in the design, the construction, the maintenance, the operation and the cleanup of the outcome that you were after in the first place, and maybe as how that outcome is adapted over time. I now want to talk a bit about limits to markets, because fundamentally, and I'm an ex-Wall Street banker, I'm not an ex-member of the Communist Party, but I have real problems, increasing problems, with the way markets are abused. And I think there's an issue we need to talk about here too, which fundamentally hits resilience. That first line, excuse me, is really important. Markets are essentially Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms. They're generate and test, see what works, filter out the good, dump the bad. But I'm not sure they ever were appropriate for big infrastructure, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But are they actually remotely appropriate in a world of climate change? So in the UK, and for those of you not in the energy world, I'll translate in a minute, but we need to build something like, order of magnitude, 10 gigawatts of primary energy generation every single year from 2025 to 2050. 10 gigawatts is about 3 Hinkley power stations, 3 of those things that are being built down in Somerset every single year. It's the equivalent of about 720 of the world's largest wind turbines, which inevitably go offshore, on floating platforms, brackets pretty much small oil rigs. These things are the height of the Eiffel Tower or the observation deck on the Empire State Building. These are whopping great things, and you need to build 700 of them a year just for the UK. Now clearly there's no silver bullets, you're not going to build 3 Hinkleys or 700 odd wind turbines, but the physical scale of this is vast, and as a consequence of the speed, we simply do not have time for an evolutionary mechanism. So markets aren't going to work for infrastructure going forwards properly anyway, and not on the big scale. They will in the supply of concrete and steel and bits and pieces. But in terms of low carbon energy itself, most forms of primary energy generation that are low carbon are zero marginal cost. So what's the market? And what does it works for that? And what does the market mean there anyway? Because if at the moment the real role of markets in energy are about forward cost discovery to try and find out which gadgets are cheaper and build more of them. But if you're maximising gigawatts a year within a price constraint, then I'm not sure that works either. So we need a really hard conversation about the role of markets in infrastructure. And in any event, you've got imperfect information. So lawmakers and the public don't actually know what asset conditions are for most of the assets in big infrastructure, and we'll come back to that, particularly post-privatisation. And managing asset condition and durability isn't a normal regulatory duty in the broadest sense. Public accounts don't help one little bit anyway. There are liabilities off balance sheet, you can't really see what's going on. Privately held assets, as a matter of company law, Section 172 of the Companies Act, your primary focus as a company is your shareholders, not your stakeholders. Now, the Better Business Act might change that in due course if it were to come through. We have to ask how we hold regulators to account and the liabilities that flow from the way decisions are made. But even more importantly than that, what is the purpose of a balance sheet here anyway? Because I can't think of any other walk of life in which things move from black to white, except in quantum mechanics, in the way that they do in the treatment on balance sheets. I've never understood, and what's more, I worry about the distortions that flow from things popping from one side of a measure to another, and the consequences on the decisions that are then made as to how to implement the consequence of those. I think it's a fundamentally dangerous process. It's almost Russian roulette. Add to that the fact that policy changes cyclically with really quite limited corporate memory within government for a bunch of reasons you can see there. But fundamentally, we don't have real deep knowledge in most public administrations, despite the best efforts of some very dedicated civil servants. And by the way, I have a huge respect for our civil servants, despite some of the noise that's going on externally at the moment. But the zinger in all this is, for those of you who know a Canadian singer of a certain age called Joni Mitchell, there's a song called Big Yellow Taxi. And somewhere in the middle of there, there's the wonderful line, You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And because infrastructure decays so glacially slowly, you don't notice that it's about to fall apart until it does. So with policy changes all over the shop like this, it's really hard to get a grip of what state infrastructure's in, how resilient it is, what you need to do to keep it maintained. And this graphic came from one of D'Maris's predecessors, about 12 years ago, a chap called Graham Ive, and it's just looking at the way public sector construction procurement has changed. And the y-axis really is value of dollar spend. But you can see it coming and going and coming and going with all manner of different ideas. But fundamentally, innovation only comes when there's big expansion, and big expansion only comes when there's the money and the political push to make it happen. But those changes have profound effects on the supply chain too, because there are periods when the supply chain is growing like billy-o, and there's periods at the bottom down here when the supply chain is struggling to stay alive, and then when they're on the way back up again, they themselves aren't resilient either because of the consequences of stop-go investment. So I now want to spend a few minutes looking at an ideal market, and I'm not an economist. So a few years ago I sat down with a very eminent economist and asked them for some thoughts on what made markets work really well and then whether or not they apply to infrastructure. And so I didn't select the list of conditions, I took what my friend wrote down. So I'm not going to read this lot, you can read them, and this is being recorded so you can see this again afterwards. But large number of buyers and sellers in infrastructure, really. Perfect information, where all consumers and producers know all prices of products and utilities each person would get from owning each product, really. Homogeneous product, no way. Well-defined property rights, yes, get that. However, no barriers to entry or exit, really? Every participant is a price taker, really? Perfect factor mobility, I didn't actually really understand that, but it doesn't sound entirely right anyway. Profit maximisation of sellers in a market like infrastructure, not entirely right, because there are some games that can be played there too. So we got a few that are sort of heading in the right direction, but then rational buyers. Do buyers make trades that increase their economic utility and make no trades that don't increase their utility? Well, if that was true, we wouldn't have monopolies, people. We wouldn't worry about regulation. No externalities. In infrastructure, really? Zero transaction costs. Let me just pick one random one, and that's the provision of the air-to-air refuelling tankers for the RAF, which is a sort of infrastructure solution. The bid cost for each of the two finalist bidders in that was tens of millions of pounds. Those are not zero transaction costs, and tens of millions aren't even marketing costs. And for infrastructure, non-increasing returns to scale and no network effects, definitely not. So markets really don't fit big infrastructure, but yet that's what we've been doing. I now want to turn to another word I used early on, which is system. And I want to look at infrastructure as a system and what system means and where is the guiding mind behind all this. So, back in the days when PFI and PPP was trendy, and I know this is a kind of case of wash your mouth out with soap and water these days, but fundamentally, the way that good PFI and PPP deals work is this classic feedback loop, where you start with an output specification of what you want achieved, you then have some sort of measurement device in the middle, and you compare the result of the output services when fed through a payment mechanism with the output spec. And then you adjust the output services until it does what it says in the tin. That feedback loop, that very classic feedback loop, and if you took the words away, pretty much any electronic engineer of any age would recognise that as a standard op-amp diagram. Infrastructure is a system. PFI used it at its heart of its theology, but all infrastructure is a system simply because of the interconnections. And we talked about earlier on that markets are really Darwinian evolutionary processes. In the absence of those, you need some sort of plan, and I don't mean the sort of Soviet 5-year tractor plan, but you simply can't take your hands off this stuff. There has to be some sense of guidance to make it happen. And given the pace and the scale that we talked about earlier on of climate change, you don't have time for anything other than a programmatic response. And the interdependencies between different parts of the system, between road and rail, for example, between road, rail and airport, between road, rail, airport and energy, mean that these things create consequences that inherently last for generations. Think back to poor old Basil Jett and his building of the sewers in the 1860s. They are still around. And my fundamental principle here is that we need some form of guiding mind behind all this. And actually, if you scale it up to looking at the whole of infrastructure, Brian Collins refers to it as a convening mind. But you can't do this, I don't think, effectively as anything other than a system response. So infrastructure as a system, there's a model on the side, on the right-hand side here from the systems thinking universe. But we've got to take, for today, given climate change, we have to focus on anything that we know that works effectively today, work on cranking that out as fast as possible, and work on change as possible off-ramps in future. Not the idea that you wait for the silver bullet to come along and you have this sort of pathetic belief that something magical will turn up in 3 years' time and solve everything for us. Because at the back of all this, if you get the system wrong and it's not somewhere down in the minimum cost for the overall system, we are dumping our grandchildren with a horrible problem, because in the 2050s, energy costs will determine national economic competitiveness. You can't help it. And you cannot, as a government, you morally cannot, in my view, abrogate responsibility for making sure that the 2050s is pretty sensible, because we are determining 2050s by what we do over the next 5 to 10 years. I have a real worry anyway, because there's certainly no currently competent body to whom we could abrogate any of this anyway, let alone competent body to whom we could ask to run this as a systems process. So I just thought, just for a quick picture, I'd show you one idea of how energy might be structured. And similar examples are needed, I think, in other areas. But if we take energy as an example, fundamentally, you've got to have security of supply. You've got to keep the lights on, you've got to keep people warm, you've got to allow industry to operate. But you've then got to make sure that it's not just secure, but it's resilient and sustainable. And you've then got to make sure that it's done at the lowest possible cost to the economy, not any particular group of consumers or users, but the economy. How you allocate between personal and business is a different issue. And it's the guiding mind that has to sit on the top of that. That's one little, very broad brush example. But we don't have any serious thinking on this going on just yet, although the government's chief scientific advisor did write a letter to the Prime Minister just before COVID hit about the need for systems thinking. And it's the first time that's really been visible. So, hang on, I think I must have just missed something there. Yeah, no, I haven't. And I'm not sure how I go back on this. Maybe down here. Let's see what we can do. Yeah, so I mentioned the word on here in the context of proper stewardship. Stewardship really means that you've got to have some form of guidance on trade-offs, on minimum acceptable quality for infrastructure. You've got to keep the capacity above a predetermined level. You've got to prioritise based on proven technologies. ... You can keep reading down there. But fundamentally, you also have to make sure at the bottom of this that the contracting parties to whom you allocate bits of the delivery part here actually have real substance. And in that context, value for money isn't about what they cost in terms of building something, but about the long-run consequences of letting them do something themselves. And what happens if they fail partway through? What happens if they can't maintain the infrastructure properly? So it's that much bigger picture. And stewardship is a word that I think goes very much with systems thinking. Now, I'm kind of heading towards, and the answer is, but I just love the quote from Amber Rudd, who was briefly Secretary of State for Energy in DEC, and who, at an interview she gave during the COP process, she said, as politicians, we know what we have to do, just not how to get re-elected if we do it. That's a huge issue, because a bit like regulators who operate over 5-year control cycles, so do politicians, and the timescales for all of them are inappropriate. Anyway, for all governments, you've got a major issue of national economic competitiveness, and with the pace and scale of change, that's a huge challenge. Pace inevitably means inefficient, and so any idea of trying to go for any sort of perfect solutions to deliver that long-run resilience just isn't going to work. And with the fundamentally different objectives, we're having to learn to optimize in two dimensions, not just the one. It's not just about price, it's about price and carbon, given all the other constraints and a duty of resilience. The word market needs a proper think from scratch, because I just don't think we've done any serious thinking about what a modern market with multiple constraints, with different constraints and multiple objective functions might be. We've got to think very carefully about the public sector, who have to make a lot of this stuff happen, at least at a commissioning level. And in reality, with the trend to the history of moving civil servants around regularly, it damages technical skills. And we're now at a position, I think, where for many of the civil servants, we're being actually abusive in asking them to do things which they've not been trained, measured or rewarded. And I'd actually add to that the way that we perceive risk in public and private sector. So I have huge sympathy for civil servants who are asked to take and manage risk, because as a private sector guy, as a banker, if I was asked to take and manage a risk and I got it right, I got a bonus and was asked to do it again. If I got it wrong, it would be a counselling or training event. If I got it wrong regularly, there'd be some very stern talking to, and if I seriously got it wrong regularly, I'd be in another job. For a civil servant, if you take a risk and get it right, nobody notices. If you take a risk and get it wrong, and you're still in post when it goes wrong, you'll find yourself in the Falklands counting penguins. It's a completely asymmetric payoff, and it doesn't produce graduated behaviour in the way that it does in the private sector. So we've got a very serious job to do to support our public sector officials and to help them build the skills and to manage that stability, and how to really adapt to a different world. And finally, I actually think that classical economics has got a lot to do to think more about economics and systems thinking. As I said, I'm not an economist, so you might be able to tell me that I've got this completely wrong. But as part of the failure of classical economics, physical constraints have to be taken so much more now into account. So when I was talking earlier on about, even on a balanced pathway to 2050 for the UK, it might involve over 100 gigawatts of new capacity of wind, offshore wind. That's 200 floating platforms a year. Where do you build 200 floating platforms? Where's the steel come from? Where do all the welders come from? How do you actually do this? The word how, again, for all the audience, whenever somebody gives you a piece of new policy, the very first question you have to ask yourself is, okay, very interesting, how is that going to happen? Because it's the how that is increasingly the killer. And the more that the how is not thought through, the more it damages resilience of the result. So, almost finished. We have a pretty limited knowledge of the state of national infrastructure. And if you want to test that, try and find out. It'd be an interesting master's job for someone to produce a national asset register in terms of an asset condition register. What state is everything in? And the infrastructure is not properly accountable to Parliament or citizens because we don't have the data to do it. And the more that we see the state of the infrastructure, the more the spend will have to happen. But I think there are three fundamental actions that we have to have. First of all, we need a proper reform of economic regulators to focus on the long run future consequences and obligations of the decisions we make today on those future generations, and to constrain the intergenerational disequity which is currently a consequence of what we do. National infrastructure, secondly, has to be treated as a system and managed, overseen by a guiding or a convening mind. And we've got to have a really hard look within all this at markets, value for money and value engineering to think about those long-term consequences and obligations. So that's my starter for 10. I have definitely missed quite a lot, but at that point I'm happy to take questions and to stop sharing my slides. There we go.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Tim. That was a very, very interesting talk and very thought-provoking. I know that I have a question for you as well, but I think let's start with one that Richard Kirkham asked about halfway through, which is that he was pondering on the importance of evaluation. We are not very good at it, hence the creation of HMT, the Treasury, and Cabinet Office Task Force in 2020. And maybe this is part of the problem. Do we really know what works in the context of complex infra? And I mean, you were saying, we don't even really have a very good asset register. And then systems thinking, we also don't have a grip on what actually works and not. But could you engage with this question a bit?
I completely agree. I don't think we've got a clue how to do evaluation properly, because so often between the point that somebody sets out with the idea of what the objective is in the first place, by the time you get to actually something being built and operated, most cases you've lost sight of that original objective. It gets buried away because it's often adapted. I'll give you a little example. If you were to go back and look at some of the original intent behind the Olympics, they were delivered on time. Great experience, I mean, fantastic experience for the UK, transformed behaviour in London. We actually had people smiling on the tube, and it really uplifted the population. But you go back and look at the original objective of the Olympics, including the legacy that was supposed to be created, poof, disappeared. And it disappeared because if you go back and look at it, at the time, the original budget that was being worked to was 2.375 billion. It was north of 9 by the time we got there. Adaptation to that massive budget included a great deal of scope reduction. But in terms of evaluation, what we evaluated was what happened on the day, not the original intent, in terms of all the legacy that was going to follow. So there's some good stuff that's happened. I mean, there's no question. But we lose sight of it. I was involved in the Millennium Exhibition, the Great Dome, which was originally meant to be a competition for the entire UK. And the idea was for cities to submit their own bids to host the Millennium Exhibition. Well, the bid that you saw actually running in Greenwich was originally in Birmingham. The Birmingham bid to host that exhibition at the National Exhibition Centre was, oh yeah, nice idea, but no, it's got to be in London, hasn't it? Because London's the capital, and I am translating very heavily. But the objective of actually starting very early levelling up, completely lost. We don't evaluate properly because we're not honest about the big long-term consequences, because fundamentally I think we've got to a position where we spend so little, really, compared to what we need on infrastructure. We don't have enough money. We're a low tax society. We don't pay taxes to make sure that infrastructure is built, because fundamentally we all pay for it one way or another, whether it's through our own taxes or through corporate taxes.
Tim.
But it's convenient to shrink the objective and to forget some of the original intent when it comes to evaluation.
No, I mean, I'm sure that's right. And thank you for that, because I think many of us would agree. I wanted to return to your question about Amber Rudd and her comment that we know what we need to do, we just don't know how to do it and get elected, which of course really is a problem in terms of shifting the view of the median voter. I know that in conversations with Bill Janeway, who I believe is doing capitalism, and Mariana Mazzucato's entrepreneurial state, which takes different views on a similar question. The issue, I guess, in the post-war moment was the extent to which the Cold War concentrated people's minds in terms of changing expectations and thus catalyzing broad public support for defense spending and other infrastructure spending at scale. Now, in the United States, it was also, though, building on the momentum of they'd already spent all this money during the New Deal for rural electrification and highway building, and there were vested interests there that wanted to continue it anyway. So the fact that you then have a new justification in the Cold War did in fact dovetail very nicely. But now, Bill was saying that his concern is that a couple of Antarctic ice sheets collapsing will concentrate people's minds, but at that point, it may be too late to respond in an optimal way. And I almost get the impression that what's happening in British politics and elsewhere is that sense that, yes, as the climate crisis accelerates, political will to do something about it will also accelerate. But timing that is really quite chancy. And the question then is, what do you do to focus people's minds earlier? Because we have with COP and the generational issues around that, a lot of perhaps light but no heat. Or heat but no light. I mean, the point is that there's a lot of talk around it, but it doesn't really seem to provide policy support for serious policy evolution. So what would you recommend, or what are your thoughts?
It comes back to what I said about the NHS for donkey's years. We just need a jolly good crisis, and you can do a lot under the cover of a crisis. I think you're quite right that in the Cold War era, that crisis was used relentlessly by all sorts of organisations. But we don't have that crisis yet. We got a big kick last September from the gas crisis. I mean, that had a profound effect on politicians and civil servants in terms of, it was frankly, with apologies for languages, geez, how much? Because you saw it shoot off scale. And that really made people sit back and think a bit just about the current state of affairs. But you're absolutely right that we produce all these pictures of what might happen to Shanghai and London if I've got a pet favourite glacier, the Thwaites Glacier, which as a Yorkshireman I've decided is really named after a Yorkshireman. It's a Yorkshire glacier. But if that thing goes, you've got best part of 2 metres rise. These things are profound, but they're not clear. They're not here. It's not a clear and present danger. And the people who get it, by and large, are not the people who are in short-term positions. So we've seen a great improvement in the reaction from Whitehall to climate change on the back of COP and the crisis that came from the gas crisis. But it needs a few more crises like that. So one of the things that could happen, which would accelerate this, is in the UK, a standard weather condition, which we've had a bit of recently, is where you get a big fat anticyclone over Western Europe. And if you time that with a really good cold flow of air, then you lose the renewables. And I'm not at all anti-renewables, but it's about the sustainability, the resilience of the whole system to cope. And you need that shock to remind people that things can go wrong. But we need to take advantage of those crises. And frankly, the more that politicians almost build up the crises to give them air cover to do things, the better. But I don't think in the absence of some stonking great crisis you'll see a big step change unless and until the finance community at large get it. And Larry Fink at BlackRock is making great steps in that direction. The use of ESG criteria for finance is kind of helpful, but at the moment it's turned into a bit of an industry. It needs to calm down to really make things happen. But you're right. I mean, we're not going to get there at this rate without an awful lot of extra work and effort.
Well, we haven't had the crises, but other parts of the world have. And the irony, of course, is by abolishing, ODA funding for the global South, we've also taken off the severity of what climate change is doing in the global South has fallen off people's radar and the sense of any moral responsibility to do anything about it. But there are ample examples in the global South of climate change causing the kind of crisis that you're thinking would change things if it hit the British shores. But in terms of other Q&A, we have an anonymous attendee saying this might be a little off piece, but what are your views on innovating procurement routes to achieve aid and construction resilience? And then Michael Lewis also has a question about how the National Infrastructure Chair called for the government's latest policy paper on utilities regulation, a missed opportunity to ensure all regulators in straining every muscle to help achieve net zero. What is your view? I mean, is the NIC chair broadly correct? So if you take a stab at those two questions.
Yeah. So the first one, in terms of innovating procurement routes, the issue for me on procurement routes actually goes back to what are you procuring in the first place. And the big failure at the moment, I think, is that we're not being anything like far-sighted enough and honest enough about what it is that we need to procure. The second part of that, in terms of procurement itself, we've done lots of experiments on this. And if I look around the world at big infrastructure procurement, for me, the biggest weakness by a long way is actually straight, ruthless, competent project management, by which I don't just mean taking the Primavera model and running that day by day, but before you get anywhere near that, the homework that you need to do before you start anything on site, all the proper work to do the really detailed design, to think through the capability and the capacity of the supply chain to deliver when you need it, that you set up the contracts that are focused on delivery, specific delivery, against a really thought through construction schedule that will work. Guys, if we can build HS1 on time and on budget, which in today's money is about 12.5 billion, that was a really complicated, messy project. We can do this, but the procurement behind that flowed from a very detailed and very thorough look at the detailed construction process day by day, hour by hour almost in some cases. And so for me, procurement is the servant of the project itself, and we need to get the project right first. On the NIC, I think the NIC completely missed the point here, that it's not about utilities regulators straining every muscle to achieve net zero, because the mechanism they're running isn't appropriate. They're focusing on completely the wrong thing. Their duties in law are around reducing the cost to the consumer over a 5-year control period. I mean, there's lots of stuff around that. but fundamentally the regulatory view isn't based on that big objective of the long-term consequences. So I would love to see the NIC wake up and smell the coffee on this, but I don't agree with the way that they approach this at all. And I suppose, so much of where they've come from, if you go back through, right back to the PFI task force and Infrastructure UK, it's been a sort of apostolic succession, but at no point has there been a revolution in there that's made somebody sit back and say, hang on, the world has changed. And I think that is a fundamental challenge for the NIC, at the moment anyway.
So two final questions from Professor Shi Liang. Do you think the government should introduce or mandate a climate resilient rating system for infrastructure and pass some of the cost of that the additional cost for climate resilience to the commercial sector? And then the second question, which is in a sense the other side of the coin because it gets into concrete examples. Graham Jones notes that 70% of infrastructure damage is caused by corrosion. Surfside Miami and the Genoa bridge collapse both look like examples of this, but none of this has caused an upsurge in the purchase or specifying of corrosion protection systems. And despite the reported 3.5% of GDP gain by adding control systems to infrastructure. So what is needed to make people think seriously about providing resilience and future proofing when billions are spent on those? And again, Professor Liang offers a solution to that.
Right. Well, in terms of Professor Liang's comments, yes, climate resilience rating systems for infrastructure absolutely ought to be there. Excuse me. But right at the outset, in terms of the spec for the infrastructure that we ask for, we should be crystal clear at the beginning about what we expect from this infrastructure. And, for me, it's kind of the Bazalgette type model, which is you've got to think really carefully, the best you can, about what you need to be able to support, the resilience you need, the ability to cope with change, not out to the ends of the distribution in both, in the widest possible, with any reasonable, a few standard deviations to the side of centre. You need to think that through because that's what you're committing. And if you don't get it right, your kids and your grandchildren will pay the consequences. So I think we have a moral duty to build that in from the outset. And infrastructure's resilience has to be built into the spec from the very outset. In terms of specifics like corrosion damage, absolutely spot on. I mean, why do you think we repaint the Forth Bridge every couple of years, kind of thing? That's what happens. I'm originally a theoretical chemist, and for those of you who did thermodynamics, T delta S screws things up. You end up in a position where corrosion will, everything falls apart. And the question is, how do you balance, honestly balance, the lifespan of an asset with its replacement? And what we always do is we always say, oh, well, of course, when it gets to there, we'll replace it. And I can remember, those of you who've been to the States, particularly around New York, there's a bridge up there called the Tappan Zee Bridge. And the Tappan Zee Bridge is very low over the river. And it's on concrete piles, on whacking great big concrete floats, on basically mud, squidgy mud. And the whole thing just kind of floats. And about, must be 15 years ago, a group of consulting engineers was asked to look at the state of the bridge and what you could do to stop it being rebuilt, because frankly, to build it was about 3 times the annual budget of New York State. And the engagement letter for these consulting engineers looking at the bridge was essentially the structural properties of rust. So, Graham, you're absolutely right that we have to be thinking about corrosion, but it's fundamentally in the sense of coming back to my earlier points about asset condition registers. If you don't know what state assets are in, and you're not honest about it to the public and the politicians, they don't get replaced in time. And so whatever your lifespan for the asset is, you've got to be ruthlessly careful to make sure that people understand that lifespan. And for me, it's not only corrosion resistance, it's corrosion detection, but actually understanding the state of your asset. That's the zinger. When the American Society of Civil Engineers say that there's 46,000 bridges in the States out of 600 odd thousand that are just not fit to drive on at all, at all. That is profound. The idea that people are driving over bridges, and I will just finish by coming back to preparedness and the lack of attention to resilience. I lived in Jersey for a while, and about a fortnight after we arrived in a town called Scotch Plains in Jersey, we met a guy at dinner who was over there, Brit, and he was surveying the railway line for electrification. And it was about a couple of days after, they closed one of the bridges in town. And he said he's going under the bridge looking where to hang the insulators for the cables, crudely translated. And he saw daylight between the two halves of the bridge. And this was a bridge where the two sides had separated. And I remember now, I remember then as he talked about it, as you drove over it, there was indeed a black line in the middle. And he said he could see daylight up the middle. And he phoned the town engineer and said, "Do you realise there's daylight in the middle of your bridge?" And he went, "Oh God." At which point iron sheets went over it, and a couple of days later it was closed. And 6 months later the bridge was repaired. But there was no idea. The borough engineer did not know because they didn't check, because nobody was doing proper asset condition surveys. And unless we're honest with each other about the state of our infrastructure, the intent behind it, and the durability and the intended resilience, frankly, we are cheating the citizens of this country, who will ultimately end up paying for it one way or another, either through their taxes or through profits into corporates to put into it some way, because it's only us that pay for it. There's no free money.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim. That's a great note to end on, and a salutary warning. And in some cases, they'll be paying for it with their lives when bridges collapse, and yeah, which should also be underlined. Anyhow, thank you all for attending Tim's very exciting talk. We will make the recordings available. And I know that some of you intend to show these recordings in your classes, which I imagine Tim is happy for you to do, if that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for the therapy, everybody.
All right, great. Thank you all. And Chisaba, if you're on the line, the next keynote is in 3 or 4 weeks.
No, our next keynote will be in April, and we will put out some promotion for it closer to the time.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and Happy New Year to those who celebrate the Lunar New Year as well.